Welcome everyone to episode 30 of What's That Sound podcast. My name's Stu Watts, and today I talked with Mitch Kenny, who's a recording and mix engineer originally from Melbourne, but has since made the move to the States, LA to be exact. He's worked with some of the biggest names in music: Beyoncé, Elton John, Chris Brown, and back here in Australia, Daniel Johns, Hermitude, Dune Rats, just to name a few. In this episode, we talked about how he made the move to the States and what that all looked like, his mixing philosophy and why he always starts with the kick drum, and also the importance of phase and compression when you are mixing. If you could do us a favor and make sure you hit follow or subscribe on your podcast platform that you're watching or listening to this on. That way you can stay up to date with each new episode. And if you could also do us a favor and share this episode on your socials, whether that's in a story or a post or in a DM or even in a conversation with someone that you think might get something out of this. We just want to spread the word to as many people as possible, and you can help us by doing that. With all that said and done, let's get into it. This is such an amazing episode. I was so stoked to talk with Mitch Kenny, so let's get into it. Episode 30 of What's That Sound podcast. You're listening to What's That Sound with your host, Stu Watts. Welcome everyone to another episode of What's That Sound. My name's Stu Watts, and today I'm here with Mitch Kenny. Mitch, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
It's awesome to have you, man. I'm finally glad to actually sit down and have a chat with you. The owner of this studio's here, Bennett, has been talking about you for a long time, so it's awesome to have you on, man.
Yeah, it's funny. Like Ben and I know each other. Both our parents were teachers, and his mum used to buy me gingerbread men when I was a little kid. So we've known each other for a lifetime outside the business. But when Marshall Street was getting going, was happy to have some from input from afar, and love to see what's going. Love to see everything that's happening there.
It's so good, man. It's awesome. So before we kind of get into, what you're doing these days, let's kind of start with a bit of an about you and kind of where music came into play for you as well.
Well, talking about both my parents were exceptionally musical. My mum trained as a singer and a pianist, and my dad was or is, I shouldn't say was, talk about my old man in the past tense, but they did pro music theatre as well as teaching, and that's my way in. If we go all the way back, playing in shows, being around it, and all that sort of stuff. I studied as a cello player. I went to VCA and didn't quite get through as a classical cello player for two reasons. First of all, I didn't have the chops, and secondly, I didn't spend that time that you need to be a professional player, but always had a real interest in audio and making records and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
And then I was in a band that no one knows of or remembers, but that was my first introduction to studios.
Yep.
And from there, did a whole bunch of live sound for a fantastic person, Jeremy Cairns, and his wife Margaret ran Versatile Productions out of Warrnambool of all places.
Oh, wow.
Doing large scale live sound. Yep. Got a gig at Studio 52. Is my first way into the business, and then did some advertising and a few other bits and pieces, started my own room, and then came to LA.
Wow.
And from there, things kind of blossomed from there.
Mm-hmm. And so if we kind of go back again just to the early days, what sort of music were you interested in? What were you listening to? What was like making you excited?
I don't know if you can see the Hoodoo Gurus poster behind me, but But yeah. Look,
the pub rock.
It's funny, like with the music that I was into as a punter, in those days was anything that was like, I love rock music, but like bands like Custard and Tism and Ween is a big one for me. Like all these bands that I loved. Not so much on the alternative space, but like we're talking like Melbourne in the like mid 90s was a fantastic place to be a music fan, and that's what I was really drawn to with the Studio 52 thing gave me a real insight into like some blues and roots as well. So I had a little bit of
Mm,
success there with bands like Morris Frawley and the Working Class Ringos and Chris Wilson, and making records that I look back on now and I had no business being in those rooms because I wasn't skilled enough. But those people were very kind to me and got to make some good records. And it's funny where I've ended up professionally is making a lot of hip hop and a lot of pop,
mm,
and that necessarily wasn't what I was into as a
mhm,
punter,
mhm.
but yeah, it's all tied together, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. And so those sorts of early sessions, what do they sort of look like? Obviously, things have changed dramatically since those days. Can you give us a little bit of insight into kind of what it was like learning, in the early stages?
For sure. So it's it's really one of the big differences between the record business in Australia and the record business here. So
Mm,
after I'd done some study and yeah, got the gig at Studio 52, I'm in the chair, I'm by myself, there's no assistant,
mm,
and away you go, off you go, son.
mm,
And there's positives and negatives to that. So on the positive side is that you're the one, you're making the record, it's you.
mm,
The negative is that you don't necessarily have people who are more skilled than you to learn from.
mhm,
And one of the big things about when I came to the States was that there's a hierarchy. There's a producer, there's an engineer, there's an assistant, and you get to sit behind people who are very, very good at what they're doing.
mm,
Sometimes also you get to sit behind people who've got absolutely no idea what they're doing,
mm,
and you're more skilled than them, and you just need to ride that out. But that's another story.
mm.
But so when I started at Studio 52, we're talking um, uh, ADAT XT, so digital based audio, 24 tracks of ADAT,
Mhm.
which had its anyone who's old enough to remember the ordeal with it. Look, it's a good format, and it was cheap, but consistent sync issues.
Right, yes.
Heads would clog. It was a real. You had to be really aware of what was going on console wise. Allen and Heath, I can't remember what it was, but
Mhm,
small fader, large fader inline console situation.
mhm.
So basically the same if you're dealing with SSL. And it worked great. And after I was there for a little while, I moved downstairs to the big room, and it's still 24 channels, a 2 inch.
Mhm.
The console escapes me at the moment because it's 20 something
Yeah,
years ago.
yep. All good.
Um, but but yeah, so primarily coming from tape based. So that's what it looked at. And look, it's something that even though it was looking back on it, it's problematic technology wise. Like some of it
Mm,
sounded good, but some of it didn't. But the
mm,
biggest thing about it is that I have a proper grounding in
mm.
signal flow. And the
Yep.
interesting thing about that is that all of the software still implies it or expects an implied knowledge of the signal flow to get
Mm,
things, right, whatever
mm,
right is.
mhm, mhm,
So I'm really glad I did it. And I'm also really glad that I did the live sound thing as well, because like the
mm.
joy of live sound is that if you make a mistake, it happens and it's gone. But the
Yes.
negative is you make something wonderful and it happens and it's gone. And that's different
Yeah.
from record making, where what you make can be there forever for better or worse. But I really appreciate my start in live sound, not only because the
Mm,
people who gave me a start are excellent people and that's forever appreciated, but the whole understanding of signal flow really
yep.
comes from that. And I think it's part of the craft that's being lost a little bit, but
Yeah.
I think it's a really important part of what we do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like troubleshooting wise, and just understanding kind of where issues can appear, and knowing like how to figure that out. If you don't understand signal flow, it's a real kind of like guessing game, and you really could just like waste a whole lot of time without
Yeah, indeed.
kind of
And
yeah.
look, this can be a very, very easy job when everything's working.
Mm,
It's only when things aren't working on a technical level, and this isn't
mm,
thinking um, about anything artistic, but on a pure technical level about you know signal in, signal out. It's very, very easy to sit in front of a keyboard and hit record.
Mm.
But when things go wrong is when the engineering comes in, and
Mhm.
also when it's time to be creative or it's time to do something which is a little bit weird or
Mm.
whatever, is when the engineering comes in. So I did a Dune Rats record at the Grove at the end of 2018,
Mhm.
and we had like signal going everywhere,
Mm.
bass. I remember recording a bass guitar, so we had it split one way for the clean, and then we had it split the same thing for my just pure DI, just so I had it, and
Yeah,
then we
yeah.
had it split going to an amp room, then we had it split another way for the pedal. So all of a sudden, we're moving one signal 4 or 5 different ways,
Yeah,
and
wow.
getting the engineering right, getting the impedance right, making sure that that's all correct is where the nitty gritty of it happens. And talking about assistants, had a fantastic assistant up there, Jack Negro, who made everything work.
Yep.
So whenever we had to drop into a real engineering type moment, there was help. But
Mm.
yeah, it's very easy to get noise and have trouble or get the plumbing wrong or have an air gap when we're trying to send things in 4 different directions for no other reason that I wanted those options later on when I was mixing the record. But yeah, it's a very, very easy job when things are working and everything's easy, but the signal flow and the experience of dealing with that stuff comes in really handy when everything turns to shit.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are things that, take a long time to fully understand and get the actual kind of application side of it. You can only like fully understand it once you've done it a bunch of times. So on that, do you have kind of like memories of things that you thought you probably needed to focus on a whole lot more? And with all of your years of experience now, you kind of go, I I just didn't need to worry about that as much as I thought that I did.
Um, I think the biggest thing that now would be I invested a lot of time understanding console automation,
Hmm.
and time code, and I think it's because I'm a little bit of a dinosaur at the moment. Like that stuff was really sync was important. Sync was
Mm,
supremely important when we're running automation off tape.
mm,
Um, did I spend too much time on it? I don't think so,
mm,
because at the time it was really important. But
yeah.
now, I couldn't tell you the last time I turned on a tape machine, and I'm glad for that as well. Look, I think people romanticize tape and romanticize consoles.
Yeah,
It's for the sort of records that I make, it is not the right format,
sure.
and Pro Tools is a better format. Because if I'm making an R&B record and I need to do stacks on stacks on stacks,
Yeah.
I need to go back exactly 2 bars each time, and the artist needs to expect there's going to be that exact same amount of pre-roll. So if I'm doing leads and doubles and triples and then quad stacks of the first harmony note and then quad stacks of the second harmony note
Mm,
and the fourth or whatever, all of a sudden we can get to very, very quickly get to 40, 50 channels of
yeah.
a little part. So being able to drop be able to play back 2 bars before that each and every time makes it easier for the artist. So
Yeah.
the limitations of tape would be, first of all, the noise is just too much, for
Yep.
the records that I make. But I think that, just how quickly that could all happen, cutting a
Hmm.
vocal, would be almost impossible on tape. And it's just, yeah,
Totally.
I think it's romanticized a little bit, if I'm being brutally honest.
Yeah.
But look, there's people who make records that don't sound like the records that I make. Like
Mm,
the example would be, like a Kevin Parker record isn't a
mm,
record that isn't going to sound like a record that I make, because I like things to sound shiny
yes.
and not lo-fi and whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
That might work on tape and that might work through a whole lot of grit, but it's not the records that I make, and it's not the
Mm,
records that I gravitate towards, on the
yeah.
radio.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into the sounds of your records and the mixing side of things later on. I still want to touch on the actual production and engineering side of things to kind of open up, how not only how you learnt all that sort of stuff, but also like what your process is these days. When it comes to production and recording, like Has it changed dramatically over the years, or kind of, is it similar to how it started?
I don't think it's similar to how it started. I
Mm.
think that there was like maybe the first 10 years, it was rapid growth until I started to work some stuff out.
Mhm.
I think it really depends on the record. Like, um, so my approach to doing a rock record, and the approaches are very different if I'm mixing it or recording it. Now I'm doing as little recording at the moment as I possibly can. The only
Mhm.
things I'm recording are my dear friend and business partner Justin Merrill. We have a production company called Happy Year. So basically, everything that I'm recording at the moment is for us.
Mhm.
I'm not making making records
Mhm.
for other people, but I'm still mixing
Mhm.
for all and sundry. So the I think it really depends on the record. So if we're doing a pop record, primarily here it's vocals over beats,
Mhm.
whether they be things that I or we have produced or if they come from somebody else. So that's one whole process. If we're doing a band record, which really isn't on the recording side, really isn't part of my wheelhouse
Mhm.
anymore. Here that's a whole different perspective. If we're
Mhm.
doing orchestral music, that's got its own thing. So
Mm.
that's a non-answer, and I understand that's a non-answer, but it really is dependent on what we're doing. On the mixing side, I think I'm a little more consistent, but very different to what I was 10 years ago, or maybe
Yeah.
well, I'm trying to work it out. So 10 years ago is an interesting benchmark for me because that's when I went to Sydney for a
Mhm.
little bit, and primarily focused or changed my focus from recording to mixing.
Sure.
So it was really, really lucky when I got there, through one thing or another, fell into
Mm.
mixing some great records. And one of the things that I think differentiated me from other people who were mixing records there was I'm probably more aggressive in my approach,
Mhm.
because my mixing chops, especially on a top end type thing, come from A-list pop and hip hop. So
Yeah.
so I approach things with a very aggressive mindset,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I think that comes through in my work, and I think that's why people call me, like, it's an old adage, but mix engineers are like flavors of ice cream. So,
Mm.
if you want, I'm going to mix something. If you get me to mix something, it's going to sound like me. So,
Mm.
I might be chocolate. Eric J might be, strawberry. No one wants to be vanilla, but like you're gonna get
Yeah.
a flavor, and that works and it doesn't work. So if you want a record that sounds like I mixed it,
Mm.
like, I'm the best bet. Again, not trying to
Mm.
rag on old mate Kevin Parker, but if you want a lo-fi grainy record, I'm
Mm.
probably not your guy,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
I'm gonna want things to pop. I'm gonna want things to be bright and aggressive, and that's kind of, that's what I'm drawn to. So that's what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many questions that I have, but it's like how do I get through all of them? But
Let's have them all.
well, I guess let's talk about some of the stuff that you've worked on. You've worked on some amazing things internationally and in Australia. You've got Chris Brown, you've got Snoop Dogg and Wiz Khalifa. These huge artists that are internationally known, like the world over. Beyonce. And then in Australia, you've got people like Daniel Johns and Hermitude, and just huge names. Not only, yeah, again, there's so many questions, but when the approaches for different artists are obviously night and day if you're comparing Daniel Johns with Chris Brown. So kind of how do you know which angle to go for?
So I'd argue that they're not that there's
Okay,
actually not
great.
that much. I'd argue that there's not that much difference. So
Great.
the thing about Daniel, so straight off the bat, it's my favorite record I've ever made
Beautiful.
by a long way. And the main reason is that Dan and I have a similar taste in records.
Hmm.
So like when I started to make the record, because it's a high pressure gig, that one. He'd released a solo record before, but this is the first one that he'd made through his label, through BMG.
Yeah.
And there's also other there's some personal stuff as well. So have got a great relationship with Heath, his brother, who runs BMG. I was also managed by the most fantastic person in the whole world, Bernadette Fadul, who was working at John Watson when Daniel was there. So there's all these relationships going on. So so I've done a couple of things for Dan. I did the Qantas Atlas campaign with the Australian Chamber Orchestra. I'd mixed a couple of Boom Tish records, or one Boom Tish record. So like we've been in each other's universes a little bit, but when the record came up, it's a high pressure record. So I mixed the first one, did my thing, and he came back and was basically, I love it. And I'm like, cool. Like, like what do we need to change? And it's like tiny little changes here or there. And I think a lot of it is because I'm a little bit older than Dan, but not a whole lot. And we've grown up on the same records. We've grown up on like a relatively shared experience, maybe more so than other people here in LA that might have been in the frame to mix the record. And the thing that, going back to your question about like him and Chris, the thing that Dan liked was he wanted something to be aggressively shiny. And that's what I like to do in terms of mixing a record. So that's why it was easy. And the same thing with making a Chris record, like it had to be aggressive, but we're talking shiny pop record.
Yes.
So there's not that much difference. I suppose in terms of the content and the production, it's a little bit different, but at the end of the day, we're trying to make something that works well on radio. And I think radio is still like really undervalued, or not still undervalued. At the moment, radio is undervalued because I understand that there's all of these different formats and there's streaming and there's like the whole SoundCloud thing, which I've been involved in as well. But at the end of the day, radio is super important. And like when we did there's a song on Dan's record, I Feel Electric, and I did something in particular with the drums and went uber pop with them. Like I went really pop. The producer pushed back and said, this isn't right. And I very rarely do this, but I pushed back again. I pushed back hard and went, no, I think I'm right. Because we're making a pop record. We're not making it feels like I'm shitting on Tame Impala, but we're not making a Tame Impala record. We're making a pop record. And with that's been something that really it went really well at radio. It was well received. It's right up there with the biggest streamers and this, that, and the other. Got the nomination for an APRA Song of the Year type stuff. So feel vindicated on that. And not, I didn't write it, but I feel that some of the choices that I made maybe helped to get to radio. And getting to radio in my world is still incredibly important.
Well, and it should be for anyone that's like wanting to have big aspirations for getting their music as far as possible. There's no reason why it shouldn't be, the ultimate place to get to. And, it's huge. And it's a phenomenal album. The sounds of it are crazy. There's all different sounds. One of my favorite tracks, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's got that really aggressive distorted guitar in the chorus. Phenomenal sound. And just like, I mean, again, there's just like such a varied sound across the board on that whole album, from track to track, and even in the individual track, the sounds are just so varied. So let's talk more about the actual approach to mixing. You talk about your mixes being super shiny and crystal clear, and I definitely noticed that. And, you get some hard-hitting bass as well. How do you achieve those sorts of sounds? And that's not a very simple question to answer, but is there like, I know that I'm doing X, Y, Z in each mix to kind of get it to a place.
Yeah, there really is.
Expand on that. Yeah.
No, there definitely is. So I think that there's the four most important things in a record are the kick drum, the kick drum, the kick drum, and the kick drum. So
Beautiful.
it is the basis of everything for lots of reasons. First of all, and again, I'm going to refer to my old friend Tal Hasberg, who, no longer with us, but always with us because he keeps coming up in conversation. Tal was an angry Israeli, Tel Avivian Israeli. And I love Tal. I love Tal with every fiber of my being. And we got to work together a whole lot. Tal would say the only people don't care about the tuning, the mix, anything. All people care about is blood, sweat, and tears and something to tap their foot to. Yeah. And he's right. So for me, it's the kick drum. So not only on an emotional level, but on a mix level, I hang my hat. The whole mix hangs on getting the kick right because it's in the center of the image. And if I can get that right, I can get the rest right, quite simply. So so I start with the kicks. I always start with the kicks. With no matter what sort of music it is, I start with the kick drum. The way that I hate saying mixed template, but the way that I start off is with I have a GML. I have a Smart C1, so the SSL master bus compressor, and I have a GML 8200. So that gets inserted over the master bus because I'm 100% in the box. I've committed to mixing in the box for years now for a number of reasons. First of all, because of the way that the revisions work, I need to have instant recall. But secondly, so I'm in my little room at home at the moment, but I've got exactly the same gear at the studio. So I can move. All I need to do is I have a PDF where I did the markings on where my EQ is and where my master bus compressor is, and then I can recall instantly pretty much anywhere in the world. And the other thing about in LA, I can depend on, no matter what other gear is there, I can depend on there being either the SSL master bus compressor on the console or a C1, but I can depend on an 8200 being there. So I can either pull up a mix or I can get to where I need to very, very quickly.
Yes.
So I start with the kicks. I usually add kicks. And funny story about the Hermitude record. So Gusto is a drummer and he's a fantastic drum programmer. And I added kicks to that record. And I remember talking to Adit from Horror Show, and Adit's first response was you flew some kicks in. I'm like, yeah, I flew some kicks in because it just had to pop a little more. And with Gusto stuff, there were a lot of stereo kicks or whatever, but I wanted a particular kick right in the middle. It had to be right in the center of the image again, so I had something that I could hang my hat on in the mix. So that's where I start. And then with everything else kind of falls into place after that. I tend to pan either hard left, hard right, or center. I don't tend to muck around with the middle, with the in-betweens. It leaves me space for the reverbs. The reverbs and the effects can kind of take that middle space. But that's pretty much it. And while I'm flying the kicks, I fly all the kicks in by hand. So I'll tab to transient and copy them in. And as I'm doing all that, first of all, it makes sure that my kicks are in time and in phase, which is the most important thing in a record. But also it gives me a chance to just absorb everything else that's going on in the record, and we fill the gaps in from there. So that's pretty much it. In terms of processing, and I think this is also a trap for young players, I tend to process as little as possible. I think one of the things that people get into trouble with early on is over processing, especially because if you've got access to basically every compressor in a software way, if you've got access to every single compressor in the entire world, the trap is to put them all on.
Yeah.
And that's fine if you're going for a particular thing, but every time you're adding like processing, you're playing with the phase.
Mm,
And if you're fine with that, if you want to play with the phase, knock yourself out. But
mm.
if you're trying to maintain some integrity in the signal, you've got to be really, really careful on adding, on adding, on adding, on adding. So
Yep.
yeah, that's how I start. And then the rest of it is pretty simple. I pull the reference in and try to beat it.
Mm.
And that's pretty much how I go about it.
That's good. And I think what's important there is that the approach is more or less about having consistency and not necessarily thinking about, I have to have the bass sitting in this place or I have to have the vocal because it's source dependent, but it's more the fact that that everything has its own space naturally, right? Like, it sounds like that.
Yeah, it does. But the other thing about it is like I trust the meters. Like the metering is really, really important. And so like on my master bus, um, there's a couple of things going on. So on I like the Paz meters, and I need to make sure that like the super low. And this is the funny thing is, so if we talk about a Chris Brown record, or we talk about a Dune Rats record, we're talking about a Daniel Johns record.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm not that interested in anything below about 40 hertz.
Sure.
So habitually I shelve off 40 hertz by 1 or 2 dB for a number of reasons. So if I'm making a club record in the club, all of that bottom end is going to be over accentuated anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that takes care of that. If I'm making a radio record, the broadcast limiter is going to squash it anyway. So I don't want it. I don't want any of that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want anything over sort of 50 hertz. If I'm listening in earpods or if I'm listening in earbuds, AirPods, whatever, that's overhyped anyway. So it means that things can appear louder without having with less loudness, and that's a really important thing. So that's when the engineering comes into it, not just the production side, because if I can take care of minus 30 hertz, I can push the fronts of the kicks harder. I can have a space behind the vocal, and that doesn't make any sense. But I can have a psychoacoustic space behind the vocal that can pop in. And for me, when a mix is working, it's like a diamond. So the width is the stereo image in the diamond. The high and low is the like
dynamics. Yep.
No, the bass, the frequency stuff.
Oh, sure.
And then the moving forwards is the effects and the space and whatever. So if I can have a mix that's moving like this, I'm winning. But to do that,
such a great approach.
Thank you. I can't have too much stuff in the bottom end, because if that's taking up all that energy, that means that I can't do any tricks. So that's there's positives and negatives with digital. The positive is it's clean and we don't have noise. The negative is that once we get to zero, that's it. So we need to try and maximize the perceived loudness without blowing things out and and squashing things just to get under zero.
It's so complex, but at the end of the day, it's efficiency, right? It's like efficiency of all of your processing. It's efficiency of the main levels and the dynamics and everything sitting together. Everything just sounds so efficient. And when you listen to the end product, like you said, it's crispy clear. Like it's all there. Everything sits in its own space. It's not, nothing's fighting. That's what I love about it. Nothing's fighting for attention. You're paying the attention where you want it to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. But the other thing about that is the compression and the compression ratios are important. So I think that one of the things, there's two things that I bang on about the whole time. First one is phase. Phase is so important and it's overlooked. Mm-hmm. The reason it's overlooked is because I'm unfortunately old enough to have to consider mono in terms of broadcast. So if you don't get your phase right, all of a sudden when it goes to AM radio, your kick drums disappear. We don't want that. Mm-hmm. The other thing is compression is multiplicative. in terms of ratio. So if I've got a kick drum compressing at 4:1, and then it's doing then it's hitting a subgroup, and we've got another 4:1, and then the master bus compressor is doing 2:1, and then the L2 is doing fuck knows what the L2 is doing. all of a sudden, we've got 100, 200 to 1 ratio on our compression. Now, that's fine, but it just needs to be, you need to be aware of it. And then it goes to broadcasts and the Optimod. So you get your record on Triple J. So at Ultimo, it hits another Optimod, which squashes it. Then it goes to the transmitter, and the Optimod at the transmitter, its whole job is to protect the transmitter. So all of a sudden, you've got 1,000 to 1, 5,000 to 1 compression on your kick drums. Now, there's not a lot you can do about the broadcast limiting, because it is what it is. Same with the streaming. It just is what it is. But not at least being aware of it, I think, is a pitfall. And that's what, going back to what I said before, that's why I'm not looking to have 15 different compressors on my kick drum. I prefer to layer them and get them right and make sure they're in phase, so that when the kick happens, the speakers go out, and when it doesn't happen, the speakers go in. That's important to me. And I think that helps with what I do.
Yeah. And having, that sheen and that crystal clarity, it definitely, like what you said just then about, the speakers responding and that sort of thing, like having space between all of the elements and stuff, that is what achieves that. And it's huge. And you're right. People just tend to kind of chuck things on, and it all squashes together, and you lose the clarity and you lose the ability to hear between instruments and all that sort of thing. So that's huge. Hey, thanks so much for listening so far. There is plenty more to come, so don't go anywhere. I just wanted to let you know that this podcast is made completely independently by myself with no sponsors. So if you like what you hear and you would like to show your support, you can send a donation to the PayPal link, paypal.me/whatsthatsound. The link is also in the show notes. Thanks so much for your support, and let's get back to it. So one thing I want to kind of expand on a lot more, because I think it would be really fascinating just to hear your story, and I think the listeners will get a lot out of it, is you're the first person I've had on this podcast that has made the move from Australia to the States and LA. I would love to know more about kind of that trajectory and things that you've learned from it as well.
So I came to LA basically. So one of the things I pride myself on in making records is that I'm ego free, that it's not about me, it's about the artist. And that's rule number one. Rule number two is the artist is not your friend, but that's another conversation. But but it's like, for example, if I'm making a record with you, you get judged by this. No one cares who mixed it or recorded it or engineered it. No one cares. Maybe some recording industry boffins or some A&R people, but even then, no one really cares. That being said, the whole reason I came to LA was all ego, just to see if I could. I had an old friend who was here, and he was going pretty well. And I made the jump. I got did I get lucky? I think I got lucky. So when I got here, I was going around to rooms and trying to chase some work, and the play was, in those days, if you ring up and say I'm looking for work, sorry, itchy nose. If you ring up and say you're looking for work, you don't get in the door. So the play was to ring the studios and say, I'm an engineer and I'm looking to book. All of a sudden you're a prospective client. So sure. I ran that all around town, and then you've got the minute from the minute from when you walk in till the minute that you walk out to pitch that I'm around. So that worked pretty well for a while, and I tried it on with at the time there were 3 or 4 women who were controlling all of the labor of recording studios in Los Angeles. There was Candace Stewart, who was runs East West. There was Paula Salvatore, who's the studio manager at Capitol, and there was Rose Manchoni, who was the studio manager at Record Plant. So I walked into Capitol and got a meeting with Paula, as a prospective client, and she picked me in about 10 seconds and just said, "So you're looking for work?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm looking for work." And she said, "I've got nothing, but my friend Rose is looking at the moment." So I walked out of Capital and sent Rose a message or called her, and her response was, "Yeah, Paula just told me about you. Come now." So Paula knew a couple of records that I'd made,
Yep.
being involved in the Universal and EMI universe, but
Mm-hmm.
there was no reason that Paula there was no reason for her to vouch for me whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to Record Plant, and Jason Carson, who was the tech and vice president there, walked me through, and he said, "Are you comfortable with the string session?" And my response was, "Of course I am. There's fewer microphones than a drum kit." So that's how I got in at Record Plant. So they had a kind of changing of the guard of their staff engineers when I got there. Through one thing or another, there was a generation that was leaving,
Sure.
and the generation underneath that, I shouldn't say underneath that, the younger generation of that wasn't quite experienced enough to deal with some of their sessions. They were experienced enough with most of them, because the thing with that time and this time as well is engineers in this city, 95% of what they do is one channel in, two channels out. We're recording vocals over beats. So that's what they were doing there. And that's fine for most of what they do. But all of a sudden, if you've got a string date, or you've got a band that needs to come in, or all of a sudden you need someone who has experience with dealing with that sort of stuff. So that's how I got my start. In the first week I was there, I did a Mary J. Blige session with Ron Fair.
Wow.
The whole Tamale 60-piece orchestra, the whole
Unreal.
thing. And that was really important, because that transitioned into a lot of work for me, because he could see that I wasn't somebody who just did one channel in, two channels out. I was also head of the label, which was helpful, and that's how I got the Nicole Scherzinger record, and that's how I got the Zedd record as well. So it was all through that. But
Yes.
Going back to signal flow and an understanding of how to make a record, I got, I say lucky, but I got lucky that at that time there wasn't a whole lot of people who had the experience that I had with big format recording. So that's the start of my LA journey. Also lucky with the visa as well. I just finished a master's program, which I did because I was doing some teaching, and you had to be going for a higher qualification than what you're assessing, and that let me get a J1 visa, which led to other visas, and
and that's a huge part of it, hey.
and now this is home. I've lived in Los Angeles pretty much longer than I've lived anywhere. So for better or worse, I'm an Angelino.
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. And so on that, obviously, your own experience is your own experience, and no one else is going to live the same life as you. But obviously, with all of the experience that you have had, is there kind of key things that you could give as advice to anyone that wants to potentially try and follow the same route, whether that's do's or don'ts?
I think the big one is, what sort of records do you want to be making? So if you want to be making pop records, if you want to be making hip hop records, like, it kind of is, unfortunately, it's here or nowhere. There can be an argument made for Atlanta, but like the scene in New York is nowhere what it was. And I make the same comparison about Melbourne and Sydney. Like, I loved living in Sydney. I had a really good time when I was in Sydney, but I'm a Melbourne boy. So the comparison between Melbourne and Sydney is an easy one to make between Los Angeles and New York, whereas the record business is in Sydney. The culture industry is in Melbourne. The record business here is in Los Angeles, and the culture industry is in New York. So if you want to be making, like pop records, or you want to be making hip hop records, and to be crystal clear, I didn't have any intention of making these records. It's just where I landed. And once I landed there, my career has kind of gone down that path. But if you want to be making records with like pub rock type stuff, this is not the place for you. If be in Melbourne, Sydney's weird, but like be in Sydney, like be in Portland, like be in London.
Yeah.
There's all these places to be where there's a scene. But if you want to be making pop records and you want to be making hip hop records, it's kind of all done here. So you've got to be here.
Yeah.
In terms of getting here, there's always a way, if you want it bad enough. And like this is a bit of a digression, but like a lot of people will ask my advice on getting involved in the business. And my first question is, are you sure? And I'm not being disrespectful with that. I'm actually being like completely genuine, because this is a bastard of a way to make a living at times, especially here where engineers get treated very poorly, especially recording engineers. Mix engineers, not so much, but if you're a recording engineer here, you can get treated really badly. The hours are terrible. You have to fight for every dollar. It's a complex thing. So you need to really want to do it, because if you don't really want to do it, there's easier ways to make X amount of money a year. Like there's so much easier ways to make a living. That being said, like there's nothing more fun in the world than making a record.
Yeah.
And also being said, the opposite of that is just hitting record isn't making a record. So when you have input, have input and it's a collaborative experience, it's the best thing in the world. When you're sitting there just, being a like Pro Tools monkey, that's not making a record. You're just hitting record. So, it's a complex thing.
Absolutely. And I think the point that you make is if you don't love it, if it's not something that you really, really, really want to do, you will constantly fight in your head the demons of this is really hard. I don't know if it's worth it. I'm tired. It's like you're just going to constantly run up against that if you don't purely love it and appreciate that the difficulties are all part of it, right?
Yeah. And like I joke about this, but like I haven't had a good night's sleep since 1992. And like I'm okay with that. I'm completely at peace with it. Like one of the funny things about my daughter's just turned 4, and people were talking about the challenges that come with having small children and whatever, especially the sleep deprivation. Like I'm fine on no sleep. It's not healthy. And I know that's going to take years off my life, but it is what it is. You've got to be sure. Like there's one of the things that I'm the most proud about at my time of Record Plant is there used to be, or there might be now as well. I'm kind of removed from it a little bit, but there was a thing where, because of the hierarchy, you have the producer, you have the engineer, you have the engineer. Sorry, you have the producer, you have the engineer, you have the assistant engineer, then you have a runner underneath that.
Yep.
So people would move up from being a runner to being an assistant engineer, and then all of a sudden they would shit on the runners. It's like, hang on a second, you're a runner 3 months ago. And they did that because that's how they were treated. So I raised my voice, and people who know me very well will know that this is weird, but like I raised my voice in anger twice in my 5 or so years when I was on staff there. And the first one, and this is something I believe in, we succeed together and we fail together. So if you go up and then all of a sudden you're ragging on a runner, that's not a vibe, because that person, first of all, is going to be in the room soon. And secondly, they might be a producer really, really quickly. Like there was a runner when I was there, Jinte Ko. Jinte's making big records now as a producer. So I'd like to, and I haven't worked with him on a professional level, but I'd like to think that if we ever did, I always treated him properly as when he was a runner. The other thing is there were a few people there who weren't sure that if they wanted to be there, and I feel really proud of having the conversation of, are you sure you want to be here? Like maybe this isn't for you. And some of those people have gone on to have great success in other fields, and I feel proud to have at least been able to have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's like having the ability to and like vision to be like, I can see something's off here and it's okay. Like I think a lot of people struggle, especially in music and creative industries, where they've built their whole life around this identity of like, I'm a creative, I love doing this. And then when they finally get to a place and it's not what they thought it was, it's really hard to confront.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Like 100%. Like the other lesson that I learned. So when I was studying cello at the VCA, the head of the strings department was a guy called Philip Green. Philip and I didn't really get along. for whatever reason, personality clash, I wasn't doing the work, whatever. But Philip said something that resonated with me then and still did, which is music isn't life, music's part of life. So I always get worried when people are like, like, with all due respect, the Australian Idol mentality of, oh yeah, music is my oxygen. Fucking, it's not. Like, oxygen is your oxygen. Music is what we do for some of us, thankfully, what we do for a living. Music is a really, really important thing, but we can survive without it. Like, we can survive and we can thrive without it. So, like, I'm an obsessive golfer. I love playing golf. I make better records when I'm playing golf because it's a moment away from a screen. It's a moment that I'm not thinking about, what's charting, what's working, what do I need to do today or whatever. And when I come to work after I've played golf pretty badly, I come with a clear head. I get to mix with perspective. That's important to me. And I think because me and old mate didn't really get along, the fact that it resonated so hard is important. But yeah, that was, like, I started studying there in 1994, and that's something, and we haven't had any interaction for the better part of 20 odd years. Or is that, how many years is that? No, it's more than that.
Yeah.
It's 30 years. But yeah, these little things stick.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I love it. And it's really, I mean, it's obviously because of your years and you see so many things that you're able to reflect upon those things that stood out to you. And I've said this in other podcasts, you might have just one sentence that you hear from someone. Like, for me, for example, my drum teacher always harped on about timing and ear protection. And those are two things that I've carried with me for all that time since I was 10. So it's like, you just never know when those little things are going to stick out. And yeah, whether you like the person or not is irrelevant. So yeah, I love it.
Yeah, but that's important as well. Like, seriously, kids, protect your ears. Like, it's like, if we've got another 15 hours to talk about this. So I always have earplugs within my reach, especially doing hip hop sessions. Like, in these big rooms, there's like, the playback is with the SSL at 11, like, we're talking 120, 130 dB peaks. So I've got 35 dB attenuators, which I carry with me always. And it's brutal. Like, I was doing Polo de Don sessions, and we did like Nelly and Kerry Hilson or whatever. It's so loud that your eyes are vibrating inside your head. It's louder than any gig you've ever been to. But there's no shame in hitting stop and protecting yourself. And if anyone has a problem with it, well, just hit stop again. Like, the great thing about being an engineer in a room is that you're the only one that can make the noise start and the noise stop. So just hit stop. Like, nothing is worth it. And if there's people who are being abusive with that, maybe it's time to be working with somebody else.
Yeah, it's, mate, facts, absolute facts. This has been so helpful and just like great to hear so many wonderful things from your experience and your perspective, and you've done some amazing work. So once again, thank you. One thing I love to do before, we finish up the conversation is, and you've already given so much advice, but if you have kind of, some final key bits of advice, first of all, for producers and engineers, and then on the other side of that, the artists, because a lot of artists will get a lot of kind of great things out of these sorts of conversations as well. And I think artists just love to get nerdy as much as we do. So yeah, if you have some of those.
I don't know if my response is going to be overly nerdy. I think the big takeaways for me is on the relationship type stuff. So I've got some. Is this for the producers or the engineers or the artists? I'm not sure, but so there's a few things, and I mentioned Bernadette Fadul earlier. When Berno and I were working together, we wouldn't commit to a project without a release date.
Okay.
Right? Because without a release date, this thing, and this goes back to being out working in the box and this, that, and the other, like, record can go on forever. We can keep changing things until the cows come home, not necessarily making them better or worse, but making them different. So the big bit of advice for like the producers, maybe this is, but definitely the engineers, and
Mm,
especially the mix engineers, is that unless there's a release date, and this goes very much for if you're doing label stuff as well. So
mm,
if there's a release date, there's a marketing plan. If there's a
mm,
marketing plan, your record's going to come out.
mm,
So if a label comes to me and says, I want to mix this record, my very, very first question is, what is the release date?
mm,
And then we work backwards from there. So my formula for mixing a record is give or take a song a day plus that again.
mm.
So an album, so saying like 15 songs is a month, because by
Yep.
the time, and I'm constantly mixing and revising at the same time. So
Sure. Yeah.
about a month is how long it takes to mix a label release, give or
Hmm.
take.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then we've also been doing the immersive stuff because we have an Atmos room, and that's a whole nother
Mm.
conversation as well. So
Yeah. Wow.
from there, we do that from the stems. So that's about another day. So if you're looking for your stereo mixes plus the immersive mixes, it's give or take 40 to 45 days.
Mm. Yep.
Now in the olden days, we need to have 6 week release lead time for the pressing and the distribution and blah blah
Yep.
blah. Not so important now, but
Yes.
there's still a process. It still takes some time to be aggregated and to be promoted. And so I know there's examples of the opposite, where Jay-Z pops into a room at midnight and cuts, and it's released at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
That can happen. That can happen, but we're all not a Jay-Z.
Yeah. Well,
So
that's
that's
it.
that's the first thing. The other thing about it is, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was Tommy Emmanuel's theory that there's 4 reasons to do a record.
Mm.
If it doesn't fit one of these 4, I won't do it. And if I'm being brutally honest, if I need to check against the 4 things, I'm probably
Mm.
not going to do it. So, is it adequately paid? Is it good for me personally? Is it good for my career? Or is it good for the community?
Mm.
Now, it only needs to hit one, but if it doesn't hit any, I'm not doing it.
Right. Yeah.
That
Yep.
that's a big one.
Hmm.
The other thing is like red flags. There's a few red flags for me. Um, the big red flag is, like we're one big family. We're not. I love my family, but one's enough. This is a business.
Mm.
It's the music business, not the music friends. And that this might sound cold, but I said it earlier, where the artist is not your friend. Now, some of my dearest friends in the whole world. I don't know if you can see over my left shoulder. There's a photo of Joyride and I. Like, I love Joyride. He's one of my dear friends, and we can be friends.
Mm.
But in terms of the artist is not your friend.
Mm.
It's too hard. So say I've had good success making a record with Daniel, for
Mm.
example.
Hmm. Hmm.
I hope that, and we've got a really, really fantastic relationship.
Hmm.
I hope to make the next record,
Hmm.
but I'm no guarantee to make the next record.
Mm.
So in the whole thing of the artist is your friend and we're buddies and this, that, and the other, that gets super hurtful when they go and make a record with somebody else.
Yep.
And like, if Daniel makes his next record with me, I would love that. I would just about walk over broken glass to do it.
Mm.
But if he chooses somebody else, that's fine, because that's just the way it is. So that's the main one. In terms of the advice for the artists is like, especially here, engineer's not the enemy. Like, it's like we perform a crucial role in getting your vision out. And going back to what I said before about the ego thing, is like, it's not about me. And this probably advice for the producers and the engineers is that, like, you don't get judged by it. The artist gets judged by it. Nobody gives a fuck who recorded it or mixed it or produced it. No one cares. So the quicker that you can remove yourself from that and go, I'll do what not what the artist wants, but my job is to try and communicate their vision. That's probably the big advice. And with that as well, like, I don't say no very often, but when I do say no, it's to the point of, I don't agree with what you're saying, and this is why I don't agree with what you're saying. But if you want it, we'll do it anyway. Like, and that's what it comes down to, because I don't get judged by this. Like, there's going to be, like, your listeners, There's going to be a few people who go diving through album notes. There's going to be a few nerds who work in A&R, God bless their cotton socks. And that's who, they're the people who know who I am. And I'm fine with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, mate, thank you for saying yes to this podcast.
It's my pleasure. It's my absolute pleasure.
It's really been awesome, man, and it's just so good to hear. Yeah, again from someone who has put in so much hard work and gotten to where you are now, and you've worked on some amazing records, and your stuff sounds fantastic. It's so good to listen to. So yeah,
you're very kind.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who has been checking out this podcast. We really appreciate it. If you could do us a favor and share it around on your socials, DMs, stories, in a conversation, that is how we can get this spread out to as many people as possible. And hit follow or subscribe so you can stay up to date with every new episode that comes out with all of our fantastic guests such as Mitch. So again, Mitch, thanks, mate.
No worries at all. Happy 200th for the Bont. Go Dogs.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. And yeah, thanks to everyone. And we will see you next time on What's That Sound podcast. Thanks for listening to What's That Sound. Make sure you hit follow or subscribe on your podcast platform to stay up to date with each new episode. We'll catch you next time.